Hello and welcome to the Omnex webinar, Best Practices in Implementing Automotive Cybersecurity and UNECE Regulations R155 and R156. Today's presenter is Dr. Juan Pimentel. Juan is a principal consultant with Omnex with extensive engineering, safety, and cybersecurity experience. Prior to joining Omnex, he was a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Kettering University. Juan has an interest in continued involvement with the standards and has served on several standards liaisons between the Industrial Electronics Society and the IEEE Standards Board. He has participated and continues to participate in various groups, including he is on the SAE Vehicle Electrical Hardware Security Task Force and on the SAE ISO 21434 Automotive Cybersecurity Task Force. During this webinar, if you have any questions for Juan, please enter them in the Q&A box and he will get to them to the best of his ability as time is allowed at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and someone from Omnex will reach out to everyone after the webinar with how to access the recording. It should occur in about a week's time, but if you have any questions, just send them to info@omnex.com. All right, Juan, you can take it away.
Yes, thank you very much, Miles. Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Pimentel, and I am a consultant with Omnex. And it is a pleasure for me to give you this particular seminar on best practices in implementing cybersecurity about the standard 21434 and also these UNECE regulations R155 and 156. I'm going to skip the few slides. You could read that on your own and just get directly into the webinar. So the motivation for this webinar is that, as everybody is aware of, in automobiles today, we have many technologies, features, and options that have created many attack surfaces. That is really a big problem for users, manufacturers, for all stakeholders. Now, the organizations are busy responding to this state of affairs in various ways. They're implementing standards, they're developing their own technique or way to address all of these cybersecurity issues. So there is not just one thing that they can do. So therefore, I thought it would be a great idea to actually talk about the webinar in terms of how do you actually implement these standards, best practices to implement 21434 and these regulations 155 and 156. The topics for the webinar, as you could see here, is I will briefly give you a summary of the 21434 standard and also R55 and R156. Now, let me clarify that this is not a webinar on going over in detail about these two. I presume that most of you have a pretty good understanding, at least what they are and the main features, all right? Now, the way that I organize this webinar is really around the so-called AutoISAC best practices for automotive cybersecurity. I thought that would be an interesting framework, and I have used this framework to organize this webinar. So I will present this AutoISAC best practices, and I will talk about the corresponding best practices from ISO SAE 21434, also from R55 and 156, correlated to these AutoISAC best practices. And then, of course, at the end, I will draw some conclusions, and there will be some time for a Q&A. So first of all, again, this is a summary of the international standard that was a joint development from ISO and the SAE, which is called 21434. So it was released after a few years, finally, in August of 2021. So it's not too long that it was actually released as an international standard. And it is consistent with the established standard for functional safety that many of you are probably familiar with, which is ISO 26262. It's supposed to supersede SAE J3061, which was a document from the SAE that was very useful for several years before this standard was actually published. The standard is based on a product lifecycle. You could think of a safety lifecycle and also a cybersecurity lifecycle, that both of them are really incorporated into this standard. The main purpose of the standard is to provide a vocabulary, some objectives, and more importantly, some requirements and guidelines as a foundation for a common understanding throughout the supply chain. So this standard talks about, in fact, working with other organizations to implement all of the requirements for cybersecurity. Now, this will enable organizations to do several things. For instance, to define their policies and processes, to manage risks, and also to foster a cybersecurity culture. And of course, there are many benefits to this standard. The main ones are here on the top right, like having a common terminology for the supply chain. And this is critical because security, as many of you know, is a very old subject. And sometimes the terminology in different areas, and more particularly in different industrial sectors, are not the same. Secondly, to reach an industry consensus in terms of managing and requirements of automotive cybersecurity. Still, another benefit would be to set the minimum criteria for the cybersecurity engineering, and also to create a key reference so that everybody can use that reference. Still, another benefit would be to build trust in terms of achieving the cybersecurity for your product. And finally, as I mentioned before, it provides an engineering framework for developing and implementing automotive cybersecurity. The standard is organized in this simplified fashion. As you could see, the numbers here denote clauses of the standard. So you have 15 clauses altogether. Clauses 1 through 4 are introductory and not really include any requirements. So the main clauses that actually include requirements start from 5 all the way through 15. As you could see, the top 2 are management oriented at the organizational level and also at the project or product dependent level. The next 2 are very practical. 7 is the distinguished characteristics of this particular 7 and 8 actually of this particular standard in terms of working with suppliers and also working with activities that goes beyond the post-production phase. The big blocks in the middle are really the life cycle phases that we talked about earlier. Concept phase on the left side, the product development phase in the middle, and the post-development phases on the right side. And at the bottom, you have the methods that's used for the risk assessment and threat analysis. The 21434 standard does not explicitly use the V model for the product development phase. And this is because it's a simplified approach. And this standard makes reference to 26262 in case you want to have a more detailed development in terms of system level, hardware level, and software level. These are details of the structure. I'm not going to go into great detail because, again, this is not a repetition of or a overview or webinar on this standard, but rather a review. This is the details in terms of the life cycle phases and also the threat analysis and risk assessment methods at the bottom. The key features of this standard, I would say that the concept phase is very similar to ISO 26262. In the product development phases, the process framework is emphasized. For instance, you're talking about a high-level process framework, recognize that many other standards and guidelines are available. In other words, this standard references a lot some of the processes that are even in other standards, such as ISO 26262 and ASPICE. It presents a unified model, which can be iterated and refined so that you could get more detailed development. This is also very similar to 26262. There are not separate requirements for system, hardware, and software, as it is in 26262. This standard does not talk about this in these three different, if you will, sections: system, hardware, and software. I would say that it's mostly about software. The system level and the hardware level are implied and implicit. There are also additional specific requirements for software development which are given. And the validation is a distinct activity to verification that this is emphasized in this standard in clause 11. The post-development phases are somewhat similar. I would say somewhat similar because there are some unique requirements to safety, such as incident response and also updates. This is the interaction at the concept phase. Again, the interaction, for instance, between the cybersecurity goals with the TARA, which is very important, and then moving down to developing the goals, and from there, going to the cybersecurity concept. In terms of risk assessment, and this is unlike 26262, there are two ways that risk is measured or evaluated. The top one is called cybersecurity assurance level, and this is a little bit similar to the ASILs in 26262. But there is a new one called risk value at the bottom, which is more dynamic and more accurate than cybersecurity level. And it has these particular values from 1 through 5. The common denominator here is that they both depend on the impact. However, the CAL depends on a attack vector measure, and then the risk value depends on attack visibility rating. This is for the feasibility of attacks and estimation of the probability of an attack. All right, in terms of the UNECE, we really have, as I mentioned before, two regulations, 155 and 156. Now, these two regulations are fairly similar in organization. I would say that 155 is a bit more general and a bit more complex than 155. So you could think of 155 as being a special case of 155. I mean, 156 as being a special case, but they're actually different regulations, as you could see. So 155 is about cybersecurity management systems. So 155 is much more directly related to ISO 21434. 156 is a bit more specific. It talks about software updates, management systems. So in short, they're called CSMS and SUMS. I will detail more about 155, which is this WP29-155, which is in the next couple of slides, mostly because it's more generic. 156 is a bit simpler. These are the main sections of the regulation. Number one, it talks about that manufacturers need to have a certificate of compliance to these cybersecurity management systems. And this is detailed in section 6 and 7.2. And these are more specific parts of the standard. For instance, it emphasizes the support of the manufacturer to identify and manage supplier-related risks. So it does talk about working with other organizations like suppliers. Number 3 is to identify the critical elements and perform an exhaustive risk assessment. Okay, so this is also pretty much correlated to 21434. Number 4 is to support the protected vehicle against risks identified in this risk management process through mitigations. So this particular regulation have, in fact, quite a detailed list of mitigations, baseline, and also ways to mitigate those vulnerabilities. Number 5 is to support the manufacturer to perform appropriate and sufficient testing. So this emphasizes this particular portion of testing that goes along with verification validation activities. And number 6 is related to the cryptographic modules that should be in line with consensus standards. This standard 155 has Annex 5, which is a little bit extensive. It has 3 sections, A, B, and C. A has really the baseline for threats, vulnerabilities, and attack methods. And B and C talks about mitigating those threats, vulnerabilities, and attack methods. The main difference is that B is inside the vehicle and C is outside of the vehicle. And these are specific details in terms of what's in Annex A and B in this particular case, of the types of vulnerabilities that they're talking about, and also the mitigations. As you could see, it's classified depending upon what part of the vehicle or what kind of vulnerability we're talking about. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about this. And again, this is C, the part C, which is, it's called backend servers. So these are mitigations for outside of the vehicle. All right, so having a good review of 21434 and these regulations, it's time to move into the main portion of this webinar, which are best practices. And I decided to organize the best practices around the so-called auto ISAC, which is well known here in Michigan, at least, which means the information security best practices, but auto stands for automotive. And they talk about and they publish, you could go to their website, 7 best practices. And then I added one more because, in my opinion, they do not address all of what needs to be addressed. So I added another set of best practices here. And I will map these best practices to the best practices of implementing 21434. Sorry for the spelling here, okay? And also the regulations 155 and 156. So these 7 best practices are around, number 1, creating an incident response plan. Okay, so this is important. Again, I will talk about how 21434 addresses this best practice. Okay. Number 2, best practice number 2 is about collaboration and engagement with third parties. So this is where suppliers come into place, but this goes beyond suppliers because it says third parties in general. Okay. Best practice number 3 is about risk assessment and also management strategy. So they combine here 2 things that are very important. Again, the management aspect and the risk assessment aspect. Best practice 4 have to do with training and awareness programs. So this is most about the human resources aspect of the cybersecurity. Number 5 is about having to continuously detect, monitor, and analyze threats. Again, this is very important, correlated to best practice number 1 about this incident response plan. Number 6 have to do with the framework for governance. Again, this will be correlated with the human resources that I mentioned before in number 4 here. So 4 and 6 are very much correlated. So this has to do with governance. Number 7 is to implement the security development lifecycle. Again, this is addressed in both actually documents that we're analyzing today, 21434, and also the regulations 155 and 156. And again, as I mentioned there, I added another set here by other, where I added some things that I believe is important best practice that is not in this list right here. So let's move on again to the best practices. Best practice number 1 from Auto ISAC is to create an incident response plan. Now, this is addressed extremely well in ISO 21434, and I put together this diagram, which is at the bottom here. In fact, in the clause 13.3 more specifically, they talk about, and there's some requirements for cybersecurity incident response, which is a consequence of or an outcome of doing vulnerability management. And in turn, this is correlated to other as you could see, activities in clause 8. So there is a very good correlation of clause 8 and clause 13 in 21434. That in fact goes back to 15, which is Tara, and going back to the concept phase, that may imply to you, if you redo the Tara, you have to go back to the concept phase and start to address those issues that you discover under these particular clauses in 8. Again, as you could see, this is very much correlated to the activities in clause 8. So 21434 addresses this particular best practice, I would say, in an excellent fashion, in a very detailed fashion. What about 155 and 156? Now, 156, being that it's specific to software updates, they don't address it. So I put not applicable here. 155 it does, because 155, remember, is more generic, okay, than 156. 155 addresses cybersecurity in general, whereas 156 is strictly about software updates. So in 155, they talk about processes. So processes in this regulation is very important. And so it is, by the way, in 21434. I did not mean that it's not, but I would say that it's important in both, in this regulation and also in the 21434 standard. So processes used within the CSMS ensure that security is adequately considered using risk and risk mitigation. And this is again of Annex 5 that I talked about earlier. And these processes includes the post-production phase. So obviously, the incident response plan is in this phase in terms of the regulation. Now, let me clarify a little bit that the name of this phase is a little bit different in the regulations as it is in the 21434 standard, but they mean the same thing. In 21434, they don't talk about post-production phase, they talk about post-development phases. But obviously, you could correlate those. So that's best practice 1. Let's move to best practice 2. So best practice 2 is about encouraging the collaboration engagement with third parties. So it's a bit generic, okay? Third parties is addressed in 21434 and also the other ones in the following way. In 21434, there is clause 7 that talks about distributed cybersecurity activities that includes the so-called cybersecurity interface agreement, which is not detailed here, but it's one of the outcomes of all of these activities. So they talk about interacting with suppliers in terms of looking at their capabilities, in terms of request for quotation, and also aligning the responsibilities of the suppliers. So this is well covered in 21434 to support this particular best practice. In 155, in Annex 1, as well as in section 9.8, okay, they talk about the description of the consideration of the supply chain with respect to the cyber activities. So the expectation is that the manufacturer will work with the supply chain with respect to many things about implementing cybersecurity for your vehicle. For instance, 5.1 Part A talks about that the verification that the manufacturer has taken the necessary measures relevant for the vehicle type to collect and verify the information required under the regulation through the supply chain. Again, it is implied that the manufacturer will work with its entire supply chain to meet the requirements of this particular regulation 155. Again, 156 is similar, but this one obviously is specific to software updates. And 3.4 says in cases where the information is shown to be covered by IP rights or to constitute specific know-how. So this know-how is very important, of the manufacturers or of their suppliers, okay? So this actually includes the entire supply chain. then the manufacturer or the suppliers will make available sufficient information to enable the checks referred to this regulation to be made properly. So they do address third parties explicitly, more particularly suppliers. Let's move to the next best practice number 3. So best practice number 3 is to build this risk assessment and management strategy. Now, this is heavy. The reason I say heavy because 21434 addresses management in 2 clauses, there, and also risk assessment in still other clauses. In other words, it's so important that it's not covered in just one single clause. And also there are many requirements in 21434 that are related to risk management and also management strategies. So this is a topic that 21434 does a really great job, in my opinion, okay? So this is only a summary in terms of what 21434 does, or the best practices, if you will, that you could apply when implementing 21434. Number 1 is to select a thorough method for the risk assessment. So for threat analysis and risk assessment method, there are several methods that it's in the 21434 standard. And one of the methods that they recommend, not the only one, is the so-called attack potential method, okay? And this is the method that they recommend to do the attack feasibility rating, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, when I did a review of 21434, there are some best practices in terms of the critical management processes that you could emphasize. And to me, critical meaning that you have to do them very well, and you have to perhaps focus on this one. Of course, there are many other processes, in the standard, but in my opinion, these are best practices, to concentrate on these processes. And they're the processes related to the cybersecurity audit, the cybersecurity case, and the cybersecurity assessment. These 3 are pretty much correlated because some companies lately are moving into another stage of all of this implementation of cybersecurity to have a certification for their product, which is not addressed in the standard, by the way. But if a company is aiming to have a product to be certified, you need to have these 3, definitely. This is, the if you will, a baseline. Excuse me. In terms of Regulation 155, again, this is important. I'm not going to go over all of the sections of the regulation that has to say something about this. I just included probably the most important ones. For instance, Section 511, Section B, it talks about documenting the risk assessment and also the test results. So that means that obviously you need to have a process to do that. Not only that, but you need to have necessary measures relevant to the vehicle type. So this particular requirement, if you will, is very heavy because it's full of a bunch of stuff here. Okay. The next one, 7222F, talks about, again, the processes. Okay, anytime you see the word processes, they're talking about obviously management to do something, right? It says used for insurance that the risk management. It turns out that this requirement, actually ties in the 2 things that it's in best practice 3 of auto ISAC. It's great. I like it because it's actually tying in the management aspects to the risk management aspect. The next one, 733, talks about that the vehicle manufacturer shall identify the critical elements of the vehicle type, okay, and perform an exhaustive risk assessment. Obviously, this is about the vehicle type portion. Remember that I mentioned there are 2 aspects in each of these regulations. One is the manufacturer, Okay, and the second one is the vehicle type, which is the actual implementation, if you will, of all of these requirements. All right, so that's about best practice 3. Now, best practice 3, again, in terms of regulation 156, which is software updates, several stuff that's related to this. I just pick up 3 of the most significant ones. 6.4 talks about, again, necessary processes to comply with all the requirements of software updates according to this regulation. Again, this is heavy. Talks about the management aspects. 711, it talks about, again, the requirements for the software update management system for the vehicle manufacturer. So there are several requirements that you need to pay attention to, specifically, in other words, this is the management aspects specifically related to software updates. And 2.5 talks about a systematic approach defining organizational processes and procedures to comply for the requirement of deliver the software updates according to this regulation. So as you could see, these regulations really talk about several requirements that are specific to this best practice. Okay, this is why this practice is so important. Let's move on to the next best practice number 4. Best practice number 4 have to do with, again, I mentioned the human resource aspect of cybersecurity, involving training and awareness programs. Again, 21434 addresses this extremely well in several areas. Okay, in particularly this, they talk about cybersecurity governance, cybersecurity culture, cybersecurity information sharing, responsibilities, and planning that have to do with this particular best practice. So this is pretty much well correlated to what you can emphasize or start off as a best practice while implementing 21434. In terms of 155 and 156, I shouldn't say that it's not applicable. I would say that it's not explicit. In other words, it is implicit because the regulations 155, 156, as you probably noticed, they're very high level regulations for the manufacturer and the vehicle type. And it doesn't go into great detail as to how does that trickle down to training and awareness programs. So I would say that they're not explicit, but rather implicit. It's important, but I cannot find anything explicitly about this in these particular regulations. But it's clear that is very important. Okay. Let's move to the next best practice number 5 from Auto ISAC says, you must continuously detect, monitor, and analyze threats. Okay, this is crucial. Again, this is basically clause 8. This is correlated to prior best practice that we saw earlier about incident response, which is in clause 13, but this is really clause 8. And 21434 does a really great job about this, okay? And as you could see, this is in fact captured in this particular diagram that I put together. Section 9.3 says that you must do monitoring of information, continuously. And you need to have a triage to decide whether or not the information that monitor constitute an event. So once you have a security event, again, you need to analyze the security event, okay? To the point that if you need to do if it looks like it's a vulnerability, you need to do a vulnerability analysis, If in fact it is true that's a vulnerability, then you have to manage that accordingly. And if you have decided that you have a vulnerability, then you need to go back and do a TAR again, which means that you need to go back to some aspect of the concept phase that needs to be redone and then redo it, So it has tremendous considerations, not only for the TARA, but also for the instant response, as you could see. You have to manage that instant response. So this is a topic that is very well explained, and also the requirements are very explicit in 21434. So in my opinion, you just need to go to 21434 and then implement this best practice that way. What about these regulations? 155, again, it does address this, being more generic, and in 156, as you could see, is not applicable. So in 155, section 511D talks about, in fact, okay, detecting and responding to possible cybersecurity attacks. So it's definitely a requirement for the manufacturer to do this. You know, it says that there needs to be a verification that the manufacturer has taken the necessary measures relevant for the vehicle type to do this. In 7222G talks about, again, processes that, this is management again, that are used to monitor for, detect, and respond to cyber attacks, in addition to cyber threats, vulnerabilities on the vehicle types, and the processes used to assess whether the cybersecurity measures implemented are still effective. So in this case, there is a cross correlation between 155 and 21434, as you could see. They address it differently, mostly because this is a regulation as opposed to a international standard, but they both address this particular topic or issue, okay? And this is why it's a best practice. Okay, let's move on to best practice 6. It says build a framework for governance. Again, this is correlated to the human resources, okay? And it is explicitly addressed in 21434. So if you go to that standard, it would be easy to implement this best practice because there is a process for governance, which is 5.141, okay, explicitly in 21434. In 155, it is clarified that CSMS, which is Cybersecurity Management System, means a systematic risk-based approach, defining, again, the organizational processes, responsibilities, and governance. There you go, it includes governance to treat risk associated with the cyber threats. So it addresses it from a very high-level perspective. So I would say that, again, if you wanted details to implement this, I would suggest go to 21434. But in 155 is definitely listed as a top level requirement. And 156 it is not addressed, being that 156 probably says, okay, not probably, but it was defined by pretty much the same people as 155, saying this particular requirement is addressing 155, so they don't address it explicitly. Let's move on to the next best practice. And in fact, we're actually reaching all of the best practices from Auto ISAC. This is the last one. But we still have one more to go because remember I said that I included other best practices. So the last best practice from Auto ISAC is to implement the security development lifecycle. What that means is that you need to view that security is a life cycle that has, you know, a beginning, an end, and actually it repeats itself, you know, repeatedly. And there is an end, which is decommissioning, if you will. But before decommissioning, you could think of being repeated over and over in an iterative fashion until it actually ends. So again, the life cycle is addressed extremely explicitly, or in a very explicit fashion by 21434, in that it considers the concept phase, the product development phase, and the post-development phases very clearly. And it talks about requirements in each one of these phases that are well explained and very clear and very specific and explicit. R155 also does this. The life cycle is implied. It talks about several phases. Again, for instance, one of the things it talks about is that the manufacturers demonstrate that their cybersecurity management system applies to the following phases. As I mentioned before, the definition of the phases does not match with 21434. However, it's very similar. You're talking about a development phase, a production phase, and a post-production phase. And you could correlate these phases from R55 to the phases in 21434 fairly well. Again, 156 is not applicable because they assume that this is addressing 155. All right, then let's move to the other best practices. I call it best practice 8, that in my opinion, should be in the list of the auto ISAC, but it's not, okay. So I'm talking about procedures and work products, claims, cybersecurity claims, and cybersecurity controls, okay. And all these 3 best practices are addressed in 21434 very well. And this is why I put it in this particular context. 21434 addresses, as I mentioned before, processes, okay? But the processes involve procedures, okay? So that's the correlationship. 21434 also addresses work products very well. In fact, it defines, I believe it's 43 or 44, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, work products that are explicitly defined in this standard. So therefore, implementing or paying attention to the work products is a good best practice. The other best practice is claims. Now, claims was just added to the latest version of this standard. It was not there in the prior versions. But I'm glad they did, because claims is correlated to the cybersecurity case. The cybersecurity case really is nothing more than having a list of arguments and evidence, of course, to say why your product is safe. The arguments is nothing more than claims. So they introduce claims to build up your cybersecurity case. I'm very pleased that this wording was introduced. It was emphasized, I would say, and also introduced in the latest version of the standard. And in my opinion, that should be a best practice. In other words, to think in terms of cybersecurity claims all the way from the beginning, because this will build up the cybersecurity product, and also this will be really the main portion of your cybersecurity case. Okay. And last one, which is also correlated to the cybersecurity case, is the cybersecurity controls. Okay, which is in 21434 is tailored to the risk values. And I put together here as a reminder how risk value is determined by this particular 21434 standard if you use the attack potential method. So you based it on attack visibility rating and also the impact rating on the left side, which has several levels, as you could see: severe, major, moderate, and negligible. And the visibility, which is again in 4 levels: very low, low, medium, and high. And then these numbers are the risk values. As you could see, the risk value is 1 through 5. The 5 meaning that you have a very stringent case where the cybersecurity is should be designed very carefully, and 1 meaning that the cybersecurity risk is very low. Okay. All right. In terms of the other one, 155, that I would recommend is that 155 talks about testing. Again, remember the context for this best practice is that it's not in the auto ISAC. So 155 talks about testing, which is very important, in my opinion. So this should be another item that it should be in this category of best practice number 8, the testing aspects. 156 talks about documentation a lot, which is implied in 21434 in the work products. But 156 mentions this over and over again in several sections. As you could see here, I just put some of them where documenting is very important. As you could see in the application for the approval for your vehicle type, okay, documentation shall be made available in 2 parts, it says. A formal documentation package for the approval containing the material specified in Annex 1, and also additional material relevant to the requirements of this regulation may be retained by the manufacturer, but made open for inspection at the type of approval. So they emphasize that good documentation is very important. And documentation, by the way, starts from really at the concept phase. It's not something that you do by the time you go for approval. So documentation, I cannot emphasize the importance of that you need to start early. Here in 7121 talks about documentation describing the processes used by the manufacturer for software updates. But it's not just for the software updates. I mean, this best practice really should be for everything. I'm just giving an example here from software updates. So this best practice is about documentation. Okay, so we are reaching the end of the webinar. So it's time for me to draw some conclusions that we talked about. So we now have two very important documents concerning automotive cybersecurity. One is the international standard 21434, which is fairly recent. It was issued just August of last year. And then two regulations for the UNECE, 155 and 156. The first one dealing with the cybersecurity management system. The second one dealing with the software updates management systems. As you could see, these two are very similar. And also I said that 155 is a bit more generic than 156. And this is what it's emphasized in the second bullet point. And in the third one, I emphasize the fact that the organization of these regulations is that it talks about a manufacturer, a vehicle manufacturer, an OEM, if you will, that has to include two things for approval. Number one is the management system. In the case of the R55 is the cybersecurity management system. In the case of 156, the software updates. And the other one is the implementation of that into an actual vehicle, which is called the vehicle type. Okay. I based my best practices in the Auto ISAC best practices that is well recognized and accepted for automotive cybersecurity. And I talked about what does it mean, these Auto ISAC best practices in terms of best practices for 21434 and also for regulations 155 and 156, okay? And I linked all of these best practices to the best practices of the Auto ISAC. So I thought that would be a very interesting thing to do. And then another conclusion is that the Auto ISAC best practices did not cover, if you will, all of the requirements, only because it's a best practice, if you will. You could argue that there are other practices that will cover some of this. And in particular, identify best practice 8, where included some of the things from 21434 and also 155, 156, that in my opinion, maybe should be added to the best practice of Auto ISAC. Okay. Now, all of this as a recommendation today from Omnex would be that my recommendation would be to start today in terms of implementing these best practices, okay, with training and doing a gap analysis in terms of seeing how far are you in terms of implementing these best practices regarding 21434 and also this couple of regulations 155 and 156. So with that, that's the end of my webinar. And the next few slides, I'm going to briefly tell you that Omnex has developed a curriculum really in automotive cybersecurity and also other related areas like SOTIC, which is software of the intended functionality, you know. And here you could see a list of some of the courses that we have developed, okay? And then also in the area of functional safety, which is somewhat related to cybersecurity, obviously. We also have a quite extensive curriculum on courses in the area of functional safety. and in fact, it goes into the next one. And an additional topic correlated to cybersecurity is automotive spies, or A-spies, if you will. Again, we have another set of courses in the area of automotive spies, as you could see. And then with that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance to this webinar. And then the next thing to do for me would be to check whether or not there are some questions. So I see that there are a few questions in my Q&A. So I'm going to answer those. The first question is, what does TARA stand for? Stands for Threat Analysis and Risk Assessment, okay? Another question is, does ISO SAE 21434 apply to suppliers of components with embedded software and FW? I don't know what FW is, but okay. SW, I understand that my understanding of that question is software, okay? So yes, absolutely. As I mentioned before, I talk about suppliers of components and particularly software, but hardware and the system are implied and not explicit, but implicit. Another question, it says BP1 and BP5 are the same. No, they're not the same. I mentioned that they're correlated, but they're not exactly the same best practices. And then the last question is about whether or not 21434 is applicable. I don't understand. I think there is a misspelling here. It says to automotive. I don't understand. There is a word that is ONLT only to automotive. I would assume that it's only to automotive. The answer is yes, but you could think of some industrial areas somewhat similar to automotive that perhaps you could apply it to, for instance, trucks, buses. I wouldn't go so far as to maybe trains, but something that, you know, it's a vehicle in general. In fact, it's talk about vehicle engineering, not so much automotive. Okay, 21434 is standard for vehicles. So, however, I would not go as far as generalizing it. For instance, you cannot generalize it to, let's say, the smart grid or the process control applications that, by the way, they have cybersecurity standards much older than automotive. Automotive is the new kid in town, if you will. Okay, I have a lot of experience, for instance, in the area of process control and chemical industries. They have their own cybersecurity standard that predates at least 15 years to automotive. Okay, so automotive is new, the new kid in town. All right. With that, I'm going to close these seminars. Miles, are you online?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. Do you want to say a few words to close this? Are we everything?
Nope, nothing else to say. Just thank you for joining, and stay tuned for more webinars from Omnex. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.